Hi everyone, it's Ardith. Today I'm here with a cute cuddly card for this week's Splitcoaststampers Featured Stamper Challenge. There's a link to the challenge and my inspiration on my blog, and the link is in the description below. To start, I created an underwater background. I taped some Tim Holtz watercolor cardstock to my board, and I got a piece of acetate that was about the same size as my card panel. I smooshed some blue and aqua Catherine Pooler inks onto the acetate. I went from darkest to lightest and used Juniper Mist, Aquatini, Fiesta Blue, and Mint to Be all over it. I used my distress sprayer to spritz water all over the acetate. I turned it over, placed it on my cardstock, and moved the ink and water around with my fingers. Smooshing doesn't give you a lot of control, but it generally gives you a really nice blended background. When I lifted the acetate, I got a dark puddle, but I just tilted my board a bit to spread it out before I brought my heat gun to it to dry it. I then used the ink that was still on the acetate to add some more color and texture by quickly smooshing it down again and lifting it up before drying it again. I squeezed my distress sprayer halfway to get some big droplets going onto the panel, and I let them sit there for a moment so that I could create even more texture by lifting off some color with a paper towel. I love the depth of color I achieved here. I pulled out my Essentials by Ellen Otterly Awesome stamp set and chose the two separate otters. I placed them in my mini Misty along with another panel of Tim Holtz watercolor cardstock. I prepped the cardstock with an anti-static powder bag, and then I inked up the otters with VersaFine Clair ink. And here's my big bin of Wow Superfine Clear Glossy Embossing Powder. I use it often, and I find it easiest to be able to use a spoon to sprinkle the powder over the image and then just tip the excess powder back into the tub. I heated the otters until the powder melted. My card warped a little bit, so I heated it from the back as well to try and reduce the warp. I used some of the newer Catherine Pooler ink colors to watercolor these guys. Sandcastle is a nice light brown. Over Coffee is a mid-brown, like coffee with milk in it. And Twilight is the perfect shade of light to mid-gray. I also used some Blackjack, which is a darker gray. I used a new Nuvo water brush that I recently got. I quite like it. The tip is very fine and I seem to be able to control the amount of water I get. I squeezed some water onto the bigger otter and started coloring him in with Twilight, letting the water move the pigment. I added some Blackjack along one side for shading and in the shadow areas. I cleaned my brush and then moved on to the smaller otter, using the browns this time. I got to the point where I felt like I wanted these two to match a bit better, so I added a bit of brown to the larger otter and a bit of gray to the smaller one, making them both a bit more taupe. I smooshed down a tiny bit of Coral Cabana ink, and I used the fine tip of the water brush to color their tongues. Once the background was dry, I used the Otterware stamp set to add to my underwater scene by stamping some water plants. This plant had an extra bit of photopolymer attached, but it was easy to carefully tear it off. I chose Daydream and Juniper Mist, two deep colors that would just provide subtle tone-on-tone images along my ocean floor. I wanted to create a heart frame around my cuddling otters, and I stamped this image with some Wow embossing ink. I used Totally Teal sparkly embossing powder from Wow. This time the result was a little more tone-on-tone and subtle than I had hoped. If I had had the matching dies, I could have made it stand out a bit more by cutting it out and popping it up, but I think it still added a nice bit of sparkle. Speaking of sparkle, I also smooshed embossing ink along the bottom third of the panel and then coated it with Sand Dunes embossing powder. This is a sheer transparent powder with a shimmery gold sparkle. I played a bit with the otters and discovered that the best way to get the little otter placed correctly is just to open the bigger otter's arms and slide him right in. To finish the card, I stamped the Cuddle Party sentiment in black on a white strip, glued it to the watercolor panel, and then popped up the otters to the left, centered in the almost invisible but slightly sparkly heart. I backed the panel onto a white mat and glued the whole thing onto an oyster card base. And that's it! I hope you enjoyed the video. These inks are fun to use with all sorts of water techniques, and the sparkly embossing powders add a fun finishing touch. Shopping links are below and on my blog. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.